You just have to have faith is an admonition we often hear from some well-meaning soul as we are attempting to swallow one of life's countless bitter pills. And there's some truth in that, but what does it mean, have faith? I began my quest for an answer by looking up the word have in the smaller of the dictionaries I regularly use, and what a surprise. The definitions require a column 5.5 inches long by 2 3/4 inches wide, more than 15 square inches, to define and describe this little 4-letter verb. Despite the extraordinary lengths to which the dictionary goes on about it, there is nothing you would not expect to find. To have is to hold, as in I have a paper clip in my hand. It is also to possess, as in she has a firm grasp of the obvious. And furthermore, it is to be possessed with or be affected by, as in the children have the measles. By comparison, the word faith requires only about 12 square inches to define. And again, there are no surprises except for what the dictionary doesn't tell us. In the first instance, faith means unquestioning belief. That certainly begins to get at what it means to have faith, to be possessed with or affected by certain convictions which we firmly hold, despite at times compelling evidence to the contrary. No matter how the pathways of our lives may be littered with absurdities, nevertheless, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. No doubt about it, that nevertheless is what it means to have faith. But it is faith at only the most elementary level. The dictionary probes deeper still in its second definition: complete trust, confidence, reliance. We may very well believe that there is a God who made heaven and earth, but then casually go on with our self-securing lives as if what we believe has no implications at all for our values, priorities, and behavior. Now there, the dictionary stops. To have faith means I believe, and it means I trust. But it means still a third thing, which is perhaps the most important, because it demonstrates the veracity of the other two. If we believe, and if we have confidence in what we believe, trusting completely the one in whom we believe, then we act in certain distinctive ways, which are significantly different than they would be otherwise. Here's the point of it. Faith is how we walk, no less than what we believe. And so we come today to consider the feet of faith. And there may be no more fickle feet than Abraham's, the father of faith. There is perhaps no Old Testament figure more venerated in the history of religion than Abraham. We find his name in the Psalms. He is often appealed to by the prophets. He was much on the mind and lips of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Abraham is the heart and soul of Paul's most cogent and compelling articulations of Christianity. Our Lord cited Abraham on more than one occasion, and as 3 great rivers which, though they flow apart, are nevertheless headwatered in the same abundantly flowing spring, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all derive from a common ancestor by the name of Abraham. Why Abraham? Because when God called him, already an old man with an aging, barren wife, to go to a foreign land which God would give to him and his multitudinous descendants, Abraham went, believing, trusting, and acting on promises, the fulfillment of which there was no convincing evidence, and which were on the very face of it outrageous. That is the quintessence of faith. But next we find him, quite some time later, still without an heir, and in the promised land that was, in fact, a land of famine, no milk and honey anywhere. So much for the promises of God, not a single descendant, and dwelling in a land that could not sustain even the meagerest existence. Thus it came to be that Abraham and Sarah made the long trek to the more fruitful Egypt, where we discover the Bible's remarkable and consistent candor. It neither condones human failings nor palliates human weaknesses, even in its most important heroes and heroines. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. Sure enough, the Pharaoh's procurer spotted Sarah, paid Abraham handsomely for her, and added her to the harem. It was only a white lie, something less than the whole truth, because as we learn later, Sarah was indeed Abraham's half-sister, an arrangement only much later forbidden. Situation ethics, no more, no less, some would have it. Here was Abraham, the bearer of God's promises, in an extremely precarious position, and through his shrewdness, he not only spared his life, but pulled one over on the imperial power, acquiring considerable wealth in the process. That he used rather dubious means to safeguard the future may be regrettable, but was, under the circumstances, understandable. Well, so much for situation ethics. Where is there even a hint that Abraham was appalled by what would surely happen to Sarah? Didn't he care? Or was his guilt, if he had any, palliated by the generous payment of sheep and cattle and slaves? There is not a shred of redeeming virtue in Abraham's behavior. For all the astonishing faith he exhibited in believing and trusting and acting on God's call, Abraham is here presented, warts and all, an anxious man of unfaith, ready to secure his own survival at whatever expense to Sarah, because he did not trust the promise. Luther shrewdly observed that Abraham let the word get out of his sight. And Calvin added that Abraham simply did not rely on the grace of God as he was called to do. There's so much about this sorry tale that we do not understand. Why were the Pharaoh and his people punished when it was unambiguously Abraham who created the problem? How did the Pharaoh associate the plagues with the presence of Sarah in his harem. But these questions are of no concern to the narrator, whose purposes in the telling are two. First, the bearer of the promise is himself the greatest threat to the fulfillment of the promise. And secondly, that God will keep his promise to Abraham in spite of Abraham's lack of faith. For all his embarrassing, if understandable, cowardice, Abraham continues to be protected by God, whose great burden is this: God cannot deny himself. Abraham was called to trust the promise, and he didn't. There's the thrust of this story first told, and here is the thrust of what is likely the same story told again. Abraham was called to be a blessing to the nations, and he wasn't. God said, I will bless you so that you will be a blessing, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. In the version which appears in chapter 20, the tale has been reworked in an effort, unsuccessful it seems to me, to make the deception less damaging to Abraham's reputation. There he regrets his stratagem, but only after he is confronted with it, makes a clean breast of things, and finally intercedes for the man he has wronged. Again, Abraham told Abimelech that Sarah was his sister, so Abimelech took her into his harem. But God warned Abimelech of the deception, who stoutly protested his innocence, which God conceded. Abraham hastily returned Sarah and confronted Abraham. What were you thinking of that you did this thing? And Abraham's lame excuse was this: I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, but not of my mother, and she became my wife. Abimelech, astonishingly, made restitution by giving Abraham sheep, cattle, and slaves, and inviting him to settle wherever he chose. And more than that, he apologized profusely to Sarah. Whereupon Abraham prayed that God would permit Abimelech's wife and slaves to have children, for their wombs had been closed fast as punishment for Abraham's near abuse of Sarah. Now, here's the first surprise: that God would engage in such an interaction with a heathen foreigner who was in no way party to the promises or integral to the evolution of Israel as God's chosen people. And here is the second surprise. Abraham excused his lie because he thought there was no fear of God in this place, when in fact, Abraham feared God. Back up. In fact, Abimelech feared God far more than did Abraham, who was the father of faith. The contrast the narrator draws is striking and deliberate. The one directly called to faith and fear is the one who models fearfulness and faithlessness. There's a third surprise. Once more, the person who acts in total innocence and is completely exonerated by God is nevertheless punished. I skirted around that troubling fact in the first story, but you would not likely be happy about it if I did it again, although what there is to say may be less than satisfying. As much as we would prefer to ignore it, There is a moral order, the workings of which do not discriminate between those who violate it knowingly or unknowingly. People experience great disasters through no fault of their own, and they also experience great blessings through no virtue of their own. Within this moral order, certain actions have an effect simply because they happen, and we sometimes suffer the consequences regardless of our knowledge or intentions. Further, there are often wide-ranging effects upon an entire community, which results from the actions of a single individual. Because of the seamless web of life, the interconnectedness of all things, those who are innocent may be caught up in the consequences of another's behavior, for which they are in no way responsible. That person may well be forgiven for the deed and thereby restored to a relationship with God and with the community. But forgiveness can never undo the consequences of the sinful act. We have to deal with that because it is there in this story twice told, and because we find it so troubling. But that was not the narrator's purpose. Rather, he wanted us to see how one called to be a blessing to the nations was a curse instead. The contrast with Abraham's shocking behavior could not be more striking. For all that was visited upon him and his people because of Abraham's deception, the Pharaoh demonstrated an incredibly generous spirit. He is clearly the hero in that first account, as Abimelech is in the second. Can you imagine the restraint and contrition and magnanimity toward the guilty one shown by Abimelech, blessing Abraham, restoring Sarah, and vindicating her virtue? Do you see now where this is leading us? One preacher on the text put it this way: there are those who will tell you that when they needed help, the world was kinder to them than the church was. There are those who will tell you that in their hour of trial, when they needed generous and kindly treatment, the hand that grasped them and the heart that cheered them was that of someone who made no profession of faith. It is a pity that such things should be. Terence Fretheim develops this insight in his commentary. This text ought to prompt the church to reflect upon God's relationship with those outside the community of faith and to question the easy and often erroneous assumptions we make about them. There is often among them an innate goodness and keen sense of justice, which puts the church to shame. Many people who are not a part of the community of faith have consciences more sensitive than the people of God, who do not have a corner on discerning right and wrong. That's the way Fretheim said it. And Jesus said it this way about the centurion who wanted Jesus to heal his daughter. Truly, I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness. Commenting on that stunning text, Suzanne de Dietrich wrote this as a warning to Christians no less than to Jews. Does not the faith and love of people who have just discovered the gospel and secretly yet dare to call themselves Christians often put to shame the inertia and indifference of those who have nominally belonged to the church from their infancy? But I can take it further than that. I have often seen more kindness shown by those for whom the word Jesus is little more than an overworked expletive in an underdeveloped vocabulary than by those who are praising the Lord for everything from a dinner that is edible to a dog that doesn't chase cars like the last one did. In A.J. Cronin's The Keys of the Kingdom, the Chinese scholar who had for so long remained aloof and turned aside all efforts of Father Chisholm, the simple missionary priest, to convert him to Christianity, said one day to the astonished priest, "The goodness of a religion is best judged by the goodness of its adherents. My friend, you have conquered me by example." More than belief, faith is trust, which leads to actions. There's a wonderful story the Franciscans like to tell about the day the saint invited a young novice to accompany him on a preaching expedition in the town. They passed through one street after another, uttering not a word, and eventually returned to the monastery. "But Father," said the novice, puzzled and disappointed, "I thought we were going to preach." And Francis replied, "We have preached. We were observed as we walked. They marked us as we went. It was thus we preached." The feet of faith. But the feet of faith are so often fickle feet. That is what the narrator wants us to see. There is never anything easy about it. Faith is always a battle, and a battle which even the heroes and heroines of faith are often defeated. "If I must die with you, I will not deny you," Peter extravagantly avowed one night. But for the cock proclaimed the dawn of the morning after, he had denied his Lord 3 times. In Abraham, as in few others, we see the sorry mixture of faith and failure that is in every one of us. In one circumstance, he is obedient beyond anything I can imagine. God said to this one, as good as dead and married to an aged, barren wife, "Go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to a land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation." And without a word, Abraham went. But the very next scene reveals one who is self-seeking, self-securing, and self-serving, trusting not in God's promises, but rather his own shrewdness, willing to shame and sacrifice even his wife for his own safety. And we are not permitted to choose between the stories. Both are remembered and treasured because both are true. Only taken together do we see faith the way it really is, a strange combination of trust and self-reliance. but there is gospel in it. God is faithful even when we are not. And more, he is willing to use us for his purposes, despite our faulty, fickle feet. And more than that, God uses others as well who may not even know his name, but whose task is ours to tell them. Archbishop William Temple said, "While we deliberate, God reigns. When we decide wisely, God reigns. When we decide foolishly, God reigns. When we serve him in humble loyalty, God reigns. When we serve him self-assertively, God reigns. Faith is how we walk, no less than what we believe. That is the burden we bear, and here is the blessing we receive. Even when our feet are fickle, God reigns." And there you have the feet of faith. What did you think?
So
Yeah, hi Mary, go ahead.
my hand here.
Yeah,
So God is faithful even when we are not, but that doesn't mean we're free of any consequences of our actions.
correct. And we can be sorry, we can confess, we can be forgiven, we can be hugged and turned around and set on the right path, but the consequences of those actions live on.
Hmm.
You know, think of this just came to mind. You remember the slaughter in the Amish schoolhouse
Yeah.
a few years ago? You know, that guy was forgiven incredibly by those folks. Still can't understand that, but they do. And yet the consequences of his actions still live on. There's still a couple of those girls that are permanently injured, I think. So yeah, God reigns. It would be scary if he didn't, but yeah, go on.
And many who are dead, I was going to say.
Right. Yeah. Was there something more? There's got to be more behind what you just said.
I think often there's an assumption among Christians that if I've got faith, if I've said the right words, God will take care of my life and everything will be fine. And then there's also the assumption that we're forgiven everything, but the consequences still go on. And I guess I cringe every time I hear someone say, God is so great, look how wonderful my life is. And I think,
Right.
I don't think there's a connection. And I think that's connected with what we're talking about here.
Well, and I worry a
our
lot.
faith ensures us an easy life.
Right. I'm very wary of that line we often hear there, but for the grace of God, go I. It scares me also when people quantify faith. I didn't have enough faith
Mhm.
or you didn't have enough faith. The faith healers often use that on people that they don't succeed in presumably healing. Um, I just think faith is belief, but it's mostly how we walk, and we cannot explain much of what happens to us by we do or we don't have this much faith.
Hmm.
Was that definition of faith or understanding of faith consistent with yours?
I will remember this. More than belief, faith is trust that leads to action.
Right.
I think I'll post that on my refrigerator for a while.
Okay. That beats some stuff I've seen on refrigerators. Somebody want to join Mary and me?
I have a question. Can you have faith without testing?
Can you have faith without testing?
Without being tested or without testing your faith? What do you mean?
Like, can you really rely on your faith without testing? I mean, how much of a role does having your faith be tested play in this whole idea of faith and trusting God?
Well, I guess that if you bump smack into one of life's absurdities and the faith you thought you had isn't there, then that does give you an indication of what you don't have. But I think you can have faith without being tested.
Okay,
But when you are tested, you know whether or not you've got it.
right.
Is that what you had in mind?
I'm sort of curious what Susan thinks. She muted
Yeah,
herself. She muted.
somebody said something about Susan.
I said, I'm curious what Susan was thinking about, like what she had in mind when she asked the question. And then she
Right.
muted herself.
I'm just wondering how much being tested is required to be faithful. I mean, you know, you can say you have faith, but until you're tested, has it really been manifested?
Do you wonder, I wonder if that is sort of we talk about sanctification and sort of confirmation of the faith we think we have. It seems to me like maybe you're asking a question about that aspect of faith, like
Possibly.
sort of what, how do you confirm it for yourself?
Or how you muster it when you are tested.
I think this is a fascinating question, don't you think, Jack? Because there are so many incredibly faithful people that we look up to as heroes, and many of them describe their faith in deeply ambiguous terms in their own memoirs and writing, especially the personal writing, which you could look at that and find that deeply depressing if you're looking for certainty.
Yeah.
I think there's
Are you thinking of Mother Teresa, or are you thinking of biblical?
Take your pick. I mean, Mother Teresa, Doris Day, Soren Kierkegaard, all of these people had a lack of certainty, and yet they chose to live as though it were true anyways.
Yeah, Mother Teresa's book is very moving, particularly when she describes at length what I call the aridity, the aridness of her faith and her seemingly ineffectual prayer life. If you want some help, that's a good place to start to do it. Back on the earlier comment about when you're tested, you muster it. I think you better have the faith before you're tested.
Yes.
Because once you're tested, you're in trouble. Think of the 5 foolish and 5 wise maidens. Once the bridegroom showed up, it was too late to go chasing off to get your oil. And they discovered also, when they asked the 5 wise maidens to share theirs, that their oil won't burn in somebody else's lamp.
Hmm.
That was so profound it put you all to silence.
Jack's got jokes
Thinking
tonight.
about.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
so what do we mean exactly by tested? Abraham, you could say, was tested and was his faith was found wanting when he decided to tell a little fib to Pharaoh to save his skin, and yet our three traditions revere Abraham for dropping everything and heading off to Canaan.
Yeah, because in balance,
Yeah.
Abraham trusted God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, is the way Paul put it.
Yeah.
Abraham's faith was tested every time he looked up at the night sky and said, somebody told me that I was going to have descendants as many as these stars, and I haven't got one, and I'm getting older by the day. But yet he kept on believing. The sacrifice or near sacrifice of Isaac, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks, was another demonstration of his faith. Yeah.
He's not particularly unique in this regard, though. I mean, Moses is going to be tested in the wilderness and he's going to fail. You know, plenty of the patriarchs make mistakes with respect to kind of
right.
their moments of testing, and yet they're still included in the pantheon of, you know, sort of spiritual parents of our
Yeah.
faith.
David.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to see how human all of these heroes are. And when you think
Well,
about
and not only what the heroes, but the people that we know and associate with every day. I often said to my congregation that when my own faith flagged, I could look out at so many of them knowing what they had been through, and yet their faith sustained them, the church sustained them, and they made it through. So we derive comfort and strength and encouragement from each other. I want to move on for just a few minutes to talk about the leap of faith. In our consideration of the feet, we came to the conclusion that to have faith means to believe and to trust and to act on the promises of God, despite abundant, compelling evidence to the contrary, despite the fact that those promises are on the very face of it outrageous. But whatever the world would make one do such a thing, there's the matter taken up in yet another strange episode in the life of Abraham. Sarah, this is going to go on a few minutes if you want to switch back. If through reason alone one could have faith, then every reasonable person would presumably be a Christian. But that certainly is not the case. And so we come to what some have called the leap of faith, to that literally miraculous moment when, forsaking the only reality we know, we say yes to the astonishing promises of God. For many, that moment doesn't come easily. Faith is always a battle between the only reality we know to be true, the plain facts that we can see and touch and analyze and predict, and that new reality as God seeks to define it. Do not be afraid. I am your shield. Your reward will be great. And in a series of sharp exchanges, Abraham dares to stand face to face with God, refuting the promises and resisting the assurance. By now, Abraham was not a little tired of hearing about this reward. He said, look, let's face the facts. The reward you promise is the gift of land for me and my posterity, But in case you haven't noticed lately, I'm a little short on posterity. The prospect of Sarah bearing a son was so tantalizing that it caused us to traipse all around the Middle East, but she was already too old when you made the promise, and she's 10 years older now. Why don't we just settle for Eliezer, the slave boy, and be done with it? It was a common custom of the period for a childless couple to adopt even a slave upon occasion, who would tend to them in their old age and see to it that they were properly buried, in return for which he was named their heir. As we make our way in this story, are you observing that the question is not inconsistent with belief, and that to seek at least some shred of evidence does not mean that one no longer trusts, and more important, that God is patient and compassionate with us in our struggle to endorse a reality beyond anything we can imagine. Let's just settle for Eliezer. But God said no. More than merely an heir, I have promised you a son. Look up and count the stars if you are able. As many as that shall your descendants be. And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteous. The leap of faith. But wait a minute. This critical and defining moment requires an instant replay, frame by mysterious frame. Let's settle for Eliezer. No, you will have as many descendants as the stars above. And Abraham looked up, and Abraham believed the Lord. But why? How? Can you make any sense of it? Just like that, he believed the Lord. There are no new data revealed in this conversation. In substance, the promise is the same one Abraham had heard before. Looking at the heavens, those same stars he had seen every night of his life, is not an argument worthy of the name. But this time, the truth of God's word came to him with all the force of a revelation. Somehow he knows that the same God who made stars beyond counting can make a son for this barren family. And that leap of faith came not from human achievement or moral decision or logical deduction, but as a gift from God. There's more to be said, however. The leap of faith, that defining moment when, perhaps but for an instant, one's clouded vision clears and the stunning truth of God's new reality is there to be embraced, does not just happen. It comes only in the life of the one who has heard the promises, struggled with them, and yearns to believe them. It is the word, the speech of God, proclaimed over and over again, which creates faith and calls it forth. The Apostle Paul got the point of it. How are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have never heard? So faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes through the word of Christ. Abraham had heard it all before. He had seen the stars before. But miraculously, in that moment, when word and sign came mysteriously together, his faith took a leap from one reality to another. He believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann calls this a revolutionary moment in the history of faith. To be righteous means to be in a right relationship with God, to believe where we cannot prove, to trust in God's future, no matter what has happened in the past, to relinquish control of the present and embrace God's promise of new beginnings. There is no other Old Testament text which has exercised a more compelling influence on the New Testament. From Paul to Luther, it has answered the questions of what faith is and how it comes and what constitutes a right relationship with God. Righteousness is not the result of works, lest we should boast. Paul warned time and time again, but is rather the result of that leap of faith when at God's own bidding, we turn loose of all we can see and touch and analyze and project and trust in promises which are on the face of it outrageous. Look at the stars. Count them if you can. So many shall your descendants be. And Abraham believed the Lord. But that is not the end of the story. Or the limit to which God is willing to go for you and me. Next, God voluntarily entered into a covenant with Abraham, taking an oath, mind you, that the promises would be fulfilled. This covenant is considerably more than an ordinary agreement between two parties. It is a formal, solemn act which binds the relationship between a superior and an inferior party, initiated by the superior party. The ancient ritual by which this covenant is entered into may turn your stomach a little. Abraham was directed to produce a heifer, a female goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. The animals were cut in two, the pieces carefully arranged, but the birds were not, and nobody knows the reason why. As darkness fell, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, which is to say, God himself, passed between the pieces. By this means, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying to your descendants, I give this land. In the book of Jeremiah, you will find the only other instance of this peculiar ritual. There, the covenant is between two humans, and as they pass between the severed animals, they invoke a curse upon themselves in the event that either is unfaithful to the agreement. Within our story, the purpose of this extraordinary act is to guarantee to Abraham that the promise of land will be fulfilled, even though that fulfillment will not come for 400 years, the length of time the Hebrews will sojourn in Egypt and wander in the wilderness before they return to conquer Canaan. Waiting is always the problem for faith. Here, Abraham learns that he will never live to claim the land, but that his descendants will. And so when the time comes, he can die in peace. But outside the story and beyond it, this covenant into which God entered with Abraham serves a larger purpose, demonstrating the depth of God's commitment to the likes of you and me. Observe first the complete passivity of the human partner. This is a unilateral declaration which God swears to at his own initiative. The word for that is grace, and a rather dramatic demonstration of it, whereby in a stunning act of self-imprecation, God invokes death upon himself if ever he were to be unfaithful to his promises. Some have difficulty in conceiving of such a thing, but it points to the depth of God's willing vulnerability, such vulnerability that his own great heart can be broken by our indifference to his faithfulness. That vulnerability became incarnate on a day we call Christmas. And then on to Golgotha, where the length and breadth and depth of it was demonstrated beyond our imagining. And then on to a communion table, where we hear words, the antecedent of which go back to that mysterious night when a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between butchered animals. This is my body, which is broken for you. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Worship is faith's leaping off place. Abraham had heard God's promises proclaimed time and time again. He yearned to believe them, but they were utterly inconsistent with barrenness, the only reality he knew, until he looked at the stars, which he had seen countless times before. But suddenly, by that grace of God, which calls forth our faith, suddenly he knew that there was indeed another reality beyond anything he could ever imagine or dare to believe. That grace of God, which alone can make all things new. There comes a time when faith must take a leap. All right. And there is this little postscript that I would like to add, which is a preview of what comes next week and picks up on what we've been talking about tonight. Those who preach on the uniqueness and finality of Jesus Christ, as indeed they must if they do serious biblical preaching, will soon discover pushback from surprising sources. People who consider themselves members of the church and committed Christians. By uniqueness and finality of Jesus Christ, I mean texts like these. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. When the religious authorities challenged Peter, demanding to know by what authority he had healed a lame man, Peter said, the man was healed in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead. There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among mortals by which we must be saved. I always dreaded preaching on those texts and others like them, knowing that at the door I would hear Presbyterian elders, deacons, and otherwise look me in the eye and say, well, I just don't believe that. Jesus may be one way to salvation, but surely not the only way. What about the people I know, probably my sons and daughters, truth be known, who are nice, upstanding people who don't go to church, but who also don't go to jail? Are you willing to tell me that they can't go to heaven? Well, no, I'm not telling you that. Deciding who goes to heaven and who doesn't is far above my pay grade. But I'm duty bound to tell you what the Bible says. And further, I'm bound to ask you this. If being nice and upstanding is all that is required for a right relationship with God, then why was Jesus crucified? Now that is the matter I want to take up next week, when we consider this, affirming the faith of those who have no faith. And I plan to leave ample time for you to have your say in the matter. It is indeed a troublesome question, and there is no doubt about it.